Great. I am a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst in Manhattan. I have a background in neuroscience. And hi, Chris.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I work a lot with autistic patients, and I work a lot with trauma and the intersection of trauma and autism, which is pretty much any autistic person who's going to come to see me has some form of trauma or other. It's a very high prevalence in this population. And I've started to do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy with specifically with autistic people because I think it helps address trauma in a way that's not accessible. Otherwise, it's much harder to access. I think it has more to do with a collapse in the inner psychic space and difficulty with one's inner world because of, I think, constant social trauma in life.
Mm.
So the ketamine creates a kind of a situation of trust and openness and lack of judgment. It also allows, I think, more synchrony between the patient and I. We're both kind of in an altered state, and we're able to put into words things that were not before accessible to language. And we're all able to together get really curious about their inner life, which was difficult to do. So that's mainly what I do.
Very interesting. I mean, and sorry, this is a completely stupid question, but just to make sure I understand. So both you and the patient are both taking the ketamine simultaneously? Is that no?
No, but that would be that I would not talk about publicly. But no, I'm
Right.
kidding.
Okay. Well, only because you said you're both in an altered state. So for a minute,
Yes, so I'm essentially meditating when
I
they're
see.
under.
I see. Okay. Okay.
Um, I have I'm much more receptive and much more attuned. And then the way that they express their experience, just recently, it was so beautiful. Somebody was talking about their chest as like a cage and it's empty inside. And then they associate to the house of their childhood, this dark house on a hill that's empty inside. And they're a bird kind of fluttering around and seeing the emptiness and the despair. And so I get a much more vivid access to aspects of their inner life that they otherwise would have a hard time putting into linear language.
Nice.
So it gives us access to sensations, bodily, implicit memories, visuals. It's kind of like a dreamlike state. And then I'm in a more receptive state to receive that, and then we can talk about it. And otherwise, for example, I'm seeing somebody that I treated for 9 years where I tried to get into his trauma with him. I knew that there was serious trauma there, and he fled treatment, and then he came back years later, but we could not get to it without the ketamine. So it really can be make or break a treatment, I think, specifically with autistics.
Hmm. Well, wow. Would you mind saying a couple words about what you think autism is to begin with, just the baseline, like what you think is going on?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, Alexey and I have been sort of talking about that and with you guys a little bit as well. In the autistic community, we say it takes all kinds of minds, which I think you could probably relate to. I love that you say that as well. So it's a different kind of mind. It's a different pattern, I think. There's changes happening all over the brain. The cerebellum's different, the sensory cortices, the thalamus, the frontal lobes, the connectivity is different across this board. So it's really a different world experience, self experience, other experience. There's no other way to, and when you try and describe it in terms of buckets, then you have social differences, which are considered deficits because they're different than its standard. You have communication differences, you have emotional differences, you have motor differences, you have sensory differences, but you're describing basically all of human experience. So it's unwieldy and it's confusing for people, but it's a neurodevelopmental difference that's there from the beginning. So it's not the same as a personality disorder or something. It shapes the way your world takes shape, and it shapes how you interact with others. So a lot of what we're seeing with autism in adults is a result of years of shaping of social interaction, which is not really studied. Um, so that's, I know it's a little bit vague. There's kind of more specific ways to define it, but I think they're all problematic. For example, for a long time, it was thought autistics lack theory of mind. Well, what is theory of mind? It's all the experiments that are designed to study theory. The way theory of mind even started was, what's the difference between a chimp and a human? Do chimpanzees have theory of mind? And I was like, no, the chimp does not have a theory of mind because it cannot figure out what the humans are doing. It cannot figure out that the humans need help with the boxes. Well, a chimp is very strong. So a chimp would not need help with the box. So why would the chimp think that the human needs help with the box? So it's very human centric and very neurotypical centric. And then the next paper was, does the autistic child have a theory of mind? And that's been the most consistent studies are that autistics do not have a theory of mind or have a weaker theory of mind. The problem is a lot of that is language dependent. So if there's language deficits, that's going to be impaired. A lot of that is dependent on the social interaction. When the examiner leaves the room, there's one study where both kids perform equally because there's a lot of autistic kids just want to figure out where the marble is. They don't care about what's happening in the mind of the other. So there's an intentional stance difference. So I think it's a very different approach to the world. It's not as hierarchical. It's not as human centric. Animals, objects, sounds, patterns. We're obsessed with patterns are all important. But it creates social deficits and real disabilities when you have to interact with a society that runs by certain rules and assumptions of what a mind should be.
Do you think that is part of the trauma that you mentioned that is so universal? Is that because of the mismatch between that kind of mind and the neurotypical society that they're trying to embed in? If it was all like, is it a stable strategy all by itself? If there was a population that was entirely that way, would that be fine, or would there be issues? Like, is it a difference issue, or like?
Yeah, I love that question. That's not been studied enough, actually. Like I think there's ways to model now agents interacting, and if we could model a neurotypical agent and an autistic agent and a group, I think we would see big differences. But in general, autistic people get along better with other autistic people. There's easier ways of communicating. They function together better, and yes, but it's much more nuanced than there's issues also with parents' expectations. Parents have a lot invested in their children, specifically in our capitalistic society, right? We're all about, I mean, the way IQ developed, the way testing developed, the way school testing developed was all based on eugenics and kind of generating productive members of society that can make money. So we're all very concerned about that. And in other societies, it's not a problem if the child lives at home the rest of their lives and helps to milk the cows, like, or whatever it is. But so parents have so many expectations and so much anxiety. And when that 2-year-old is not talking or walking or whatever it is, if they're on a different developmental trajectory, and they may talk at 4, they're just not talking at 2 because there's so much sensation and patterns and sounds to like enjoy, the parents freak out. And then you start to have ABA and you start to have like, now you need to smile. Like I'm just seeing somebody now, I have like records of like reports. He's not smiling today. Today was a good day. They smiled, they followed the rules, they whatever. They're disobedient, they get punished harshly. And there's a constant feeling of you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. That's not to say that autism is a big spectrum. So it can come with inability to speak, inability to take care of oneself. It can come with profound deficits and disabilities, but so can neurotypicals. Like we can all have intellectual disability. It's not, I don't think that that's what defines autism itself.
Is it more common in males? Is that a thing? And if so, do you have any idea why?
So this is an amazing story. I was trying to tell Alexey, there was a Russian psychiatrist in the 1920s, probably a psychoanalyst, because all psychiatrists were psychoanalysts back then. And she described in this hospital a group of boys and a group of girls with what exactly Asperger's described 20 years later. And she said in the boys, there's much more stereotypy, like repetitive movements. There's much more very abstract obsessions. There's much more like lack of emotion completely. The girls tend to be moody, emotional. They have big reactions and big tantrums. They're disobedient. They like hate following the rules. They're basically like wild little whatever. And so they're different from the boys in the sense that they're less likely to have atypical interests. The interests are more typical, like social interest, books, and they have much bigger emotions. She basically defined the female autistic phenotype, but she was completely ignored being a woman. And then Asperger's came and Canner came, and the majority of Asperger's and Canner's boys were boys. Their patients were boys. So all the studies were developed to study the boy phenotype. And so therefore that you confirm, sure, there's many more men than women or boys than girls, but that's because that's how your questions were set up. And so now they're rediscovering the female autistic phenotype. It's much more equal than it was thought. It used to be before there was 4 to 1. I don't think that. And by the way, like some men have the female autistic phenotype, not surprisingly, because it's not brains aren't entirely female or entirely male.
Are there models of it, either animal models or AI kinds of models? Are there, so for purposes of experiments and so on? Do you think there are decent models for this?
Um, I think there's partial models. I think Alexey can maybe speak more to this. For example, there's a knockout mouse where I forget exactly what they do, but they affect the thalamus and differences in sensory gating in the thalamus. Basically, more sensory information, more bottom-up information coming in, more sensory information, less gating. And that's kind of a model that I think a lot of us are really simpatico with, that our brain doesn't curate information quite as much. We just let a lot more in. And then it's harder to process all of that. So some things might be slower, but we're also going to see details that other people don't see. So there's that mouse model. That mouse model develops seizures, develops cerebellar ataxia, certain kinds of things that they see in some autistic kids, but not all. There's a lot of syndromes that look like autism. And the problem is it's such a lot of different diagnoses were combined. So it's a huge umbrella. There's not really one autism. I think it's like a lot of different neurodevelopmental differences that come up with a social deficit or social disability in our world, and therefore called autism. But so a model that the FEP model of it is that it's essentially not enough prediction and too much sensory precision. So Alexey, I'm sure, understands the details of that better than I do. But that's another model. There was a movement-based model coming from I forget the country in Europe. Northern Europe has a center that has developed a lot of models of motor differences. So there's like the emotions are more intense, less coordinated, and that creates kind of friction in social interactions. The kid is like in another child's space, or their whole mind gets organized based on a motor system that's too intense. There are ways of thinking about it as lack of early studies showed increased connectivity in local regions and decreased across distal regions. So there's models of lack of cohesion or integration of different modalities of sensation, motor, speech, etc. So that's kind of I don't know if that's been, I don't think it's been modeled by computers, but that's a neuroscientific model.
I see.
Alexey, we've been listing some. Are any others coming to mind?
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Oh yeah,
First of all, very grateful that Mike and Chris, you are, joining in this effort, because what I thought we could do. I mean, first of all, I learned so much from Diana, and I've both did psych evaluations and treated in therapy patients with high functioning autism. I haven't worked with low functioning autistic patients, and I'm very grateful, Diana, because I learned so much, and I was driven by some stereotypes and biases, like, okay, theory of mind issue, okay, or social deficit, and now we're finding more nuance that perhaps there's a deficit of fluid theory of mind, or fluid or spontaneous theory of mind, but it's not a global issue. And boys and girls problem, and the consequences of trauma, and disproportionately how much children in autistic community get bullied in school. They wear a target on their back, and then if there's bullies, they pick the neurodiverse kid. But what I thought we could do is, as a again, I asked Diana to write phenomenological patterns of what it sort of feels like by the patients, and we just wrote them as a list without trying to infer why, how, or draw connections. And we have a list now, which I can read briefly, just the list of like maybe 13 patterns now. Some are pediatric. We see them very early on at 12 months. Some are more later on, and they kind of come together in interesting ways. I see connections, which is why I thought about you, Mike, and you, Chris, because you're fantastic at doing sort of scale traveling from lower scales to higher scales in space, in time. And we need, a biologist and computer science and mathematical and physics mind to see and to kind of to see how we could try to connect the dots here. And there have been prominent theories of autism, like, Frith in England about the, weakness of central coherence, and, other ones, but they don't do enough. They sort of describe a part. But that's one component why I thought it would be fantastic to hear from you both and your thoughts. Another one is treatment, because what Diana is doing with ketamine, and I see kind of inflexibility and difficulty to change something is very hard in regular treatment. But when Diana and I talked, one of the mechanisms of plasticity in ketamine is mTOR. And we have talked so much about mTOR, Mike, in your work in both stress, adaptive stress and maladaptive stress, and also in plasticity, that that's another thing. And there, in that regard, we could do experiments. In fact, I may have sent some. So both biological experiments with sort of the specific underlying mechanisms of that plasticity, and ketamine would be NDMA, but we could approach mTOR through 5-HT or from nutrition and other things, and indeed do animal experiments. So yeah, but I'm talking too much. If you want, I can just read you the list of patterns to see how it sounds.
Sure. Yeah, go
Is
for
that
it.
okay?
Sure.
So I'll just, without again any inference on how and why. The pattern one is challenges with fluent or spontaneous theory of mind tasks when a person is in the state of higher sensory load, while having no such challenges in the state of low load. The second pattern is overincorporation, is what we called it in Rorschach. Attending closely, paying much attention to many stimuli in the environment, and possible challenges with deprioritizing some stimuli and focusing attention on higher priority ones. Pattern number 3 is not prioritizing social stimuli over other ones. Pattern 4 is difficulty disengaging or shifting attention away from, and related heightened ability to hyperfocus on something. Some people may describe it as challenges with attentional flexibility. Pattern 5 is difficulty with joint attention with a caregiver, which affects learning and parenting. This we see very early. And pattern 6 is, again, weak central coherence. Individuals with autism tend to focus on details rather than see a big picture or gestalt. That's a difficult part, to go in the higher abstraction level and to conceptualize. Pattern 7 is what we call concreteness, difficulty in processing more abstract or metaphorical content from neurotypical individuals. Pattern 8 is a style of kind of doing one thing at a time. So this is, again, differences in how neurotypicals process things, which they may more flexibly think about several things at the same time. Pattern 9 is challenges with transitions and changes in childhood, such as going to recess after class or changes. Pattern 10 is the experience of struggling to connect different modalities, such as sensory, exteroceptive modalities, interoceptive data with proprioceptive data. And Diana mentioned it. And I've added a few from a pediatric specialist, Jody Bleiberg. This is what we observe in children as well, is difference in cognitive flexibility compared to neurotypical kids. They tend to be a bit more black and white, rule-oriented, and staunchly logical. Pattern 12 is proclivity to interpret or explain emotions or social reactions from a logical standpoint. Some might say that it's proclivity to be right over being together with a person. And the 13th one is a bit more coarse-grained or logical perception of emotional states. They can identify angry, but sort of the shades of gray, like irritable or annoyed, may be more difficult. So this is a long list, but I mean, how does it sound to you?
And coordination and motor issues, which I think we have to add, because it's almost, it's described by every studier.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Can I ask kind of what maybe kind of a meta question here, which is, you've both used the phrase neurotypical, which occurs, of course, throughout the literature. And I guess my question is, what do you see as the range of variation in the population that's considered neurotypical? And how large is that range of variation compared to both what you would consider the center point, if that's even definable, and I tend to doubt that it is, between the neurotypical population and the autistic population? And also, how large is that range of variation compared to the range of variation that you see in the population that's considered autistic? So how easy is it to separate these two populations?
So what Francesca Huppe's research shows is that there's, I can't remember exactly how she buckets it, but there's these kind of three buckets that go together: communication, social, cognitive maybe, and motor sensory, or however she divides it. They tend to travel in families. So they'll see traits of a certain kind of cognitive style traveling in one family, and they'll see traits of a social emotional style in another family, and then they'll see traits of motor sensory issues in another. And then when these buckets come together, you get an autistic kid. But you can see in their grandparents and their genealogy traits. So these traits are human traits. They're part of the population. It's just that when you combine them together, you get, I guess it's treated as a syndrome. You get a syndrome of a number of traits coming together. So that means the variability is huge, and that means it's hard to separate. But and I don't see the big range. I mean, I worked in camps with autistic kids before, and I've interacted with, but I don't treat autistics with high service needs. But I have autistic adolescents to people in their 70s. I've seen the range and for some years now, and they are, the saying is, you've seen one autistic. Like, they're just as different from each other as neurotypicals are from each other. They all have character, like we all have character. There's definitely kind of types. There's like a more social type that's the ADHD, we call it, the ADHD and autism together, because the ADHD piece is like seeking novelty and chaos and excitement all the time. And the autism is needing consistency and calm and like repetitive behavior so that you know what's going on, because it's overwhelming otherwise. You put them both and you get a very excitable social autistics who then needs a lot of time to recover because they're completely burnt out. So that's like a type that I see. There's definitely like different little types, but it's very variable. I feel like the DSM criteria that we have do distinguish an autistic person from a neurotypical person, but you can't see it. So people really try to they look autistic or they don't look autistic. You can't see it because, of course, there's also high masking, which is the way that the person mimics. Like, there's a lot of mimicking and mirroring social interactions in girls, and they learn how to be excellent actresses. But if you ask them how they do it, it's a very intentional way of doing it. So that's one big difference, is that the autistics will look neurotypical and do the neurotypical things, but it's all cognitive. It's all thought through. Well, they initiated the interaction and I'm going to copy what they do, or if they smile, I'll smile too, or whereas it's much more intuitive for a neurotypical person. And I think all of it has to do just with a bigger cognitive load, essentially. So you can distinguish them, but I think I don't know, the actual metrics are hard because the ADOS misses a lot of autistic women. I have a very impaired autistic woman who was not picked up by the ADOS. So there's not a good standard to tell all the time the difference. And I'm not aware of any MRIs or EEGs or anything that predict, like, the medians are different. Like in anything else, the medians separate out, but the individual population you can't separate out. I don't know if that gets to your question.
A little bit to what Diana said, Chris. So first of all, recently I've heard people say something like, oh, it's a spectrum, therefore we're all on the spectrum. And, individuals in autism community take a big issue with that. They're saying, no, you're not, just don't do that, right? There is a difference. Now, it may not be easy to define. And again, we have kind of a whole methodology of neuropsychological testing. And I spoke recently with just sort of, the top neuropsychologist in our area, Jody Bleiberg, who's fantastic. And, she gravitates slightly away from ADOS too, because it's too simple. A lot of things, it's very kind of sort of operationalized, manualized. And then it's just one of the tools we use. It's a play-based assessment of a child, and it is normed, Chris, from 12 months old. So right now, the kid may get diagnosed at 12 months. And but what to answer maybe your question with a little data, there are studies that are very interesting on eye tracking in an infant. And the individuals with autism tend to, when you look at the eye tracking, look at mom less. And then when the parenting starts, the big thing in parenting is joint attention, where mommy says, look over here. And that is also a difference between an infant and a mom in a child with autism and child without. And it's not just vision, now they're doing studies on audition, mom's voice. But again, paying attention, because this is an absolutely crucial interaction. We have this fantastic psychologist, researcher, and analyst in New York City, Beatrice Beebe, and she studies this complex dance between an infant and a mom. It works differently when the child has autism. And then it leads to other consequences when they're 4 or 5 and they hit preschool and kindergarten. So maybe it's not answering your question fully, but so there is a difference. And we're approaching and kind of how to get better in doing it. The tools that we have are imperfect, but eye tracking, I think, shows some promise. Maybe. And just to say one more thing about it is, with adults, again, if you walk into a room and there's a painting, and the painting has a social scene, right? The neurotypicals, the way they tend to do is they follow the line of sight. They look at this guy who's looking at this woman, and this woman is looking at that woman. A person with autism may start examining the pattern on the couch. So, yeah.
It sounds like a little bit of the frame problem, no, Chris?
Well, in the sense that the frame problem is basically a boundary drawing problem, yes.
Well, in terms of, sorry, no.
When listening to or reading the set of typical patterns of behavior, none of those sound very atypical to me. And so my question is, in a sense, how atypical are these atypical patterns? And if you were just to take one of these and assay 10,000 people at random, would you get a bimodal distribution? Would you get something that looked like a normal distribution, but it had kind of a long tail on one side? Or, how, the question is, how atypical are we talking here? I mean, maybe that's not an important question at this point. I don't know.
The issue is also quantitative approach. I will tell you, though, that in my much more limited experience than Diana, when I did school visit as part of the evaluation, the kid stands out. When you see, elementary school kids and the neurotypical one, there's a big range of emotions. There's like, this and that and the other, and you see a more constrained range where it was like anger, happy, and sometimes they express it in a kind of something said happened and they're smiling. So but you see the kid stands out, sometimes. But again, because we're talking about the spectrum and there's a level of functioning, when it's a low functioning autism, it's going to stand out very much. When it's high functioning, it stands out differently. But you can qualitatively kind of, and I realize I'm saying something contrary to what Diana, but I'm saying early on, pediatrically, in my experience, I saw the difference. And again, if you have stereotypy and sort of repeated movements like rocking and other things, then it stands out quite a bit. But sometimes you see that in perhaps slightly lower functioning cases. So,
Chris, I think you bring a really good point, though, because I don't think it's that atypical, except that I think our society has become so specialized and so social, so hyper social, and so overstimulating. Like most of us would have not gotten picked out. Like, my grandfather, like, loved classical music and worked as an editor and had this like very, had his obsessions and his little world, and he couldn't change a light bulb or drive a car, but it didn't matter. And he was like perfect. Nobody would have ever called him autistic. But today's standards, probably he would be, because he would need to buy things online and communicate with a bazillion people if he tries to buy something or have a simple interaction. And so um, I think it's just a tail end of the population that also is getting, I don't know what the word, not to use a crude word, but is basically left out of the game in some ways, and getting very bullied in other ways. But sometimes, it's Bill Gates and Elon Musk and whatever, like it, and girls, like their repetitive movements, like could be picking your nails and curling your hair. Nobody sees that. But you don't have any friends. And like, so that's the cumulative, like not having any friends, struggling to date, struggling to become independent, not understanding why things are happening, why people are dropping you, or why you're not part of a crowd, or you're smart enough, but you can't get a mentor and your projects don't work as well because people get turned off by you, but you have no idea why. So it's this cumulative experience of being on the tail end or on the margin, but not really understanding why you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, with trauma, the best predictor of not developing PTSD is social support. So now once you get hit by trauma and you don't have the social support, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you. If we think about the different axes on which, so you pick whatever the most important axes are on which this population is different. Is it possible to go in the opposite direction? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it conceivable, or in fact, is there a real that basically is to neurotypical what neurotypical is to autistic? Like, go in the opposite direction. Does that exist?
Good question.
Well, there's that old paper by Crespi and Badcock from long, long ago in behavioral and brain science, where they argued that autism and psychosis were two ends of a spectrum, where neurotypicals were sort of in the middle. And I think that's largely been discounted now. I mean, I never hear people talking about that, although I'm not all that familiar with the literature. But that was at least an early proposal in this.
Well, that was Simon Baron-Cohen's book too. That
okay.
Simon Baron-Cohen's theory is that psychopaths have high cognitive empathy. They can understand. They have very good theory of mind. They understand exactly what's going on in the mind of the other. They have no affective empathy, so they don't feel any of it. They couldn't care less, and they can manipulate people. And autistics have the opposite. We get hit by a wave of emotion. We have very high nociception, so we really feel what like a little bug is feeling, or an animal, or a child, or a human. But then there's so much intense stimulation, it's hard to quickly come up with possibilities about what's going on. And also we consider too many possibilities. So anything could be possible. We can come up with like 10 stories. So we can't intuitively quickly act on this is what's going on, this is what they need sometimes. So we have high affective empathy, but sometimes low cognitive empathy. And so he said we're on the opposite ends of the spectrum. But of course, yeah, humans are not that simple. I would say politicians are the opposite. The social maneuverers, the social movers and shakers.
Just
many
to go,
probably are psychopaths.
Many are, yeah. With Mike's excellent question, if we take Isaac Newton, no friends, no lovers, no wife, physics, one interest, narrow interest, intense, and that's it. Immanuel Kant or Grigory Perelman, who proved the Poincare hypothesis. There's just mathematics, right? And in kids, we see that there's just Lego, and he is like, rocket scientist in Lego, but there's sort of nothing else. And then it moves to dragons, and there's like encyclopedic knowledge of dragons, and there's sort of nothing else, hyper focused in one sort of narrow thing. So perhaps, yeah, it's just like Diana expressed, when somebody is like, a mile wide and an inch dip, and they're just very social, hyper social, center of attention, everything, but you ask them about mathematics and they know this much, so maybe, but I can see the kind of both in this sort of domain. Somebody is very, very different from that, but we don't tend to kind of and again, it's a matter of fit and adaptation. If the story of Sherlock Holmes, for example, he sounds to me slightly Aspergerish, but you see that these individuals, they make for exceptional forensic investigators because they notice things that very social oriented person doesn't notice, like this whatever clay from Staffordshire on your shoes or something, right? But then the other ones are just really preoccupied with social context, and they don't look at that. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another axis, because you're talking about broad versus vertical, deep. Another kind of axis that I was thinking in the context of mTOR, because mTOR is kind of the regulator of resilience versus plasticity. When is it time to like rebuild your organelles and reinforce the membrane, and versus let's change and be plastic. I think my intuitive sense and from what I read, I think autistics are actually hyperplastic, and are like a lot of there's a high coincidence of loose joints too. Like there's sometimes a physical hyperplasticity where a lot of us are double jointed. EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, is over 50% of autistics have this. So I think we're put together in this kind of loose way. That's the word, the weak central coherence. So then the rigidity is required actually to hold us together. So if you have a person who internally is very rigid, like in the sense of like, I know who I am, I know what I want, I know what I'm going to do about it. That's the opposite, like, because we're actually indecisive. We could be anything. We could morph into anything. We take on anything, like, and it gets too much, and then we fall apart.
That's super interesting. I mean, that reminds me of Bongard and Pfeiffer's morphological computation. This notion that you can't separate the controller from the body, that basically a lot of the cognition is actually happening in the body, and this issue that the plasticity is sort of an issue both sort of mentally but also physically, right? That's incredibly interesting.
That was a long-standing theory that the mind is put together from a body metaphor that's very loose and plastic.
Yeah. So I wonder, as we flesh out some of the behavioral studies of xenobots and anthrobots and all these things, which we are doing, we're setting up all kinds of like behavioral tests. We can quite readily modulate things like tissue stiffness and things like that, and actually see if there is. I mean, I know what's going to happen. People are going to look at those papers and they're going to say, well, that's just physics. They're going to say, you're made it more squishy, and so now it tends to go this way. Well, that's what everybody always says. It's just physics, right? But I think it's an interesting idea to connect those.
Yeah, I think that we're a different pattern. Yeah. And if it doesn't become reified as like the right pattern and the wrong pattern, yeah, and that's why I would love to see modeling of like agents interacting together, because if you make somebody looser, they might end up needing to be more separated from the group. Like, I love your experiment of stress sharing. That's another thing because that ability of the cell to communicate to the others, it's distressed because it belongs in the head, not the tail or the arm or the limb. And all the cells just move around for it. And I'm thinking, how lovely if we could just have that. If autistics, first of all, we could communicate clearly, which is hard. But then if other people just accommodated, we could all have lower stress levels. But of course, that's considered whatever, entitled or whatever it is. But we're so individualistic. We don't. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent now.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alexey.
No.
Well, I was just going to say that the ketamine, it's not obvious to me in the end what we are and aren't going to be able to get our hands on, because obviously there's a lot of access issues to some of these compounds, but we're working on it, and I'm very interested in trying some of these things in morphogenesis assays, in what does it look like to be on that spectrum in gene expression space, right? Are there a set of diseases actually that are because of those kinds of trade-offs in the way that you would process let's say chemical signals, right, for cells and things.
Yes, there's a lot of immune issues, very high, they call it mast cell degranulation syndrome. A lot of inflammatory and immune issues also in autistics, very prevalent, IBS, stuff like that. Yeah, so your immune system is more sensitive too.
I think Yeah, if you get a chance after at some point, if you want to send me any of those papers that kind of describe some of that stuff, we made a tool a little while ago. I used to have my students do this by hand, but then we made a tool, and it's on the web to do this, where you take a neuroscience paper and you just do a find replace, and everywhere it says neuron, you just say cell, and if it says millisecond, you say minutes, and most of the time you get yourself a developmental biology paper. Like, it doesn't take very much to, sort of pivot it, and everything works out, right? So I would be very interested in, and by the way, Thomas O'Brien has now added on that tool. You can now map things into economics. You can map them into, there's a whole drop down of disciplines you can map them into. It's pretty fun, and it would be interesting to take some of the descriptions that you've put out today and just turn them into other spaces. So right, what does that look like as a developmental biology paper, as an immunology paper, as a signaling paper, and then go back, because as you're saying now that there are in fact, let's say, immunology aspects of this that have been characterized, go back as if that were that, treat that as the ground truth, and come back to say, okay, so were we able to recover any of those actual facts, right? Any of those observations? I think that would be really fun.
I think another interesting exercise might be to go down this list of behavioral patterns and sort of keying off something you said, Diana. Try to think about, suppose you had some generic organism that behaved in this way or exhibited this pattern. What would the right kind of environment for that organism be? And try to think about it from the environmental side of the question, as well as the organism side of the question.
Yeah.
In humans, there are philosophers, specifically phenomenologists and embodied cognitive philosophers, that are writing and thinking about this very much in terms of how the interactions need to happen differently.
Yeah.
Sharing, if you could share some of that, some pointers to that literature, that could be
it's
brilliant.
Hannah De Jager is one of the big. She's in De Jager. I can't remember where she is, in the Nordic country. Yeah, I'm happy to send them.
What we did actually was we assembled a library of papers, and we continued to populate it. So that's already ready on Google Drive. We send it both access to you, Mike and Chris, and so you can launch the bot to try to reclassify neurons into something else. It's ready.
Okay.
But another thing is, in terms of environment, once they, let's say there's intense interest in this physics, and then Newton with his physics, he's good, or Kant with his philosophy. There's a famous animal researcher, Temple Grandin, who is a big name in autism community, and the interesting part about her, again, there's no husband, no friends, and another thing, but she has a hugging machine at home made of, I think, pelts, and she has a remote control that hugs her with precisely the intensity or the pressure that she wants. But her science is the environment in which she feels good and well, and and sometimes there's papers written or books by individuals with autism, such as My Life with Asperger's by Robinson, or Born on a Blue Day by Daniel Tammet. And Robinson was into like radio electronics and just mechanical things, and just give him that, he's happy, right? And he's married now, and fascinating book also. But I think that is sort of like, when the environment matches your prediction, there's not a lot of change, and you feel contained and sort of. And maybe I'm trying to answer, Chris, your question, but we do have some qualitative narrative human accounts of when the person feels well enough, adapted, adjusted. And we have very sad stories where the society is trying to change you and fix you, particularly in ABA, where we're going to coach you out of it, or like fix you and whatever, and then it doesn't end well, so to make you fit our expectations, and yeah.
And to add to that, exercise. So dance, I saw one girl who started dance therapy at the age of 3 for severe tantrums. She was never diagnosed, but the parents just had an intuitive way with her of, what's going to help and what's going to calm down. Being very receptive to the motor sensory, the nonverbals, the way that the person is in the world. and then finding creative ways and allowing that to be. So she's a great dancer, and the tantrum stopped. A lot of us are very intense movers. Ultramarathon runners are, a lot of them are autistic. I do Ashtanga 6 days a week, yoga, swimming, intense motor things that help you feel coherent in the body, make you feel stronger mentally as well. And then a lot of room to play and to experiment and to, yeah, like I think like that's the funny thing is a lot of us autistics say that neurotypicals are very rigid because like, what's the problem with stimming? Why can't we not stim? Like, why is that an issue? Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay. Yeah. Well, that sounds great. So I think, yeah, let me take a look at the papers. And I think, yeah, we'll do some translation, and we'll think about some experiments, that we can actually do. I think that would be really interesting.
Awesome.
Super interesting. Yeah, thank you for this. I appreciate it a lot, and thank you for making the connection, Alexey. I learned a lot. I was really not aware of a lot of this, so that's awesome. Yeah, very interesting.
Do you have to go, Mike, or we have another few minutes, or?
I have about 5 minutes, unfortunately, but
5 minutes. Okay, got it.
But let's keep going. And if you guys want to keep going, we absolutely can. I have a little situation here that I need to.
We'll end, but you got to go. It just, Chris, you had some thoughts about dimensionality. Maybe you can say briefly about what you thought after looking at the patterns, and just say a little bit more about this dimensional approach you had.
Well, clearly, one of the dimensions seems to be this context switching dimension. And then another one seems to be this what's called loose central coherence, but there were several representations of that in the list. And I'm very intrigued to hear about the physical correlates in terms of kind of lack of tight coherence, because so much of problem solving seems to be done by the motor planning system, which if it's used to very loose connections, that might clearly connect to the way problem solving works as well. So I think we could pursue that kind of dimensional approach, perhaps. And I would think that applying a very similar way of thinking to the population that counts as typical would be useful if we do that kind of dimensional way of thinking. I mean, how good are typical people at context switching? I have no idea whether that's been measured or.
There's a paper that measures that.
Okay.
There's a virtual reality paper where they alter the bounciness of the ball, and I think they're, I don't know if they're imaging or recording, but the autistics are slower to adjust to the change in the bounciness of the ball than the neurotypicals.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. So those seem like two fairly clear dimensions. The social, non-social dimension seems more difficult to me to get a handle on. But I guess lots and lots of people have been trying to do that over the years without too much consistent success.
I mean, what in theory, and this is something that we were talking to Tom Pollock about, is we could make anthrobots from tissue samples. And I mean, we have social dynamics among xenobots and anthrobots. They do have collective behaviors, and so we could look at simple models of that. That's a possibility, right? We've got our SEMA effect, and stuff like that, right? All kinds of matching, and yeah, the attention thing is super interesting. We're still sort of struggling to quantify that in some cases. I would love to know how to say, okay, here's how much attention the cell is paying to XYZ. So measurements of those are still worked out, but as far as the behaviors, yeah, we absolutely have collective behaviors that we could, We could measure, I think some of the information theory metrics could get a handle on collectivity, on causal emergence of the group. Actually, has anybody done that in humans? Watching human behaviors of autistic, hybrid, and neurotypical groups doing stuff and doing, PID or some kind of causal emergence metric on that?
There's studies that look at groups, but I don't know if they do that specifically.
Because there's cool new math that's been developed over the last, I don't know, whatever, 10, 15 years that basically captures the extent to which the whole is more than the parts. Let's put it that way, I guess you could say, roughly. And so it might be really interesting to apply that math. In fact, if the data are out there, it might not even need to be new experiments. You might just be able to to grab the data, and we could do it. Federico computes this stuff all the time. So if the data are there, we could do it,
Sounds
There's
like
a paper on social
extremely,
synchrony that's different.
Yeah. It sounds like the context may be an incredibly important variable in thinking about group problem solving.
Mm-hmm. But maybe, you know what, maybe that's part of the issue that you raised, Chris, about finding the environment to match the kind of mind. Is you could imagine, okay, here's my data set. Now, what would the environment have to have been like to raise the phi-d to whatever level, right? Like, and so then you could certainly do simulations. You've got your data, keep that fixed. Here's the behaviors. That's how it's going to be. Now the question is, what do you need to put around it to make this coherent? I think that would be a super cool study to do. Yeah, that would be really interesting. Let's look at the data. Yeah. And I wonder too if we build classifiers around that data, could we say that, okay, here's an evolutionary process of a search for something? Is it some kind of evolutionary track? We could say, does that have features? I mean, what does a more autistic looking evolutionary track look like? So I was exploring this environment. I got, did or did not find what I was looking for. Maybe I got stuck on some local, maximum, right? Like how much, could there be once we're looking at behavioral data, I'm motivated to sort of track it across some really weird problem spaces, and we might find that this kind of spectrum has uses well beyond, traditional behavior.
That's part of what confounds researchers and studies, is that the development can look so different. It's not like, so somebody can start by looking very autistic, nonverbal, and can end up being Asperger's and like writing books. There's no way to, like, it doesn't seem like there's a good way to predict how somebody's going to end up. And if you catch it at different timelines, it looks very different.
Yeah. Amazing.